The almost fanatical atheist Richard Dawkins, who is still likely the leading champion of the story of evolution, has repeatedly revealed his faith in the non-observable. For example, he stated in an interview that evolution has been observed, it's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening.
What's going on, guys? First dinosaurs, now evolution. Calvin Smith from Answers in Genesis is on fire. In this video, you're going to hear one of the most succinct breakdowns of the theory of evolution you've ever heard. Let's be honest, evolution is everywhere. It's taught in every college. It's taught in most of every public schools. And if you've heard it, it sounds legitimate. And if you are an unsuspecting Christian who listens to teachers, you go to school and you hear the theory of evolution being taught, it is going to be jarring to your faith. And most Christians aren't equipped to engage this conversation with educators. So they hear it and their faith is rocked. Evolution is something serious. But in this video, Calvin Smith gives a thorough breakdown of every major point evolution has to offer, and he demolishes it. I'm excited to show you this video. Let's get to it.
The story of evolution has been popularized to the point of cultural saturation now, in education and media, ranging from peer-reviewed journals to pop culture icons, such as one of the most popular superhero teams of all time, the Uncanny X-Men. And if you're somehow unfamiliar, this team of cultural outcasts with a wide range of dynamic powers and abilities are classified as mutants. And how did they get these metahuman abilities? Well, perhaps some of you may remember the opening monologue in the very successful original X-Men movie, given by Professor Charles Xavier, the mutant super team's leader, played by actor Patrick Stewart. Mutation. It is the key to our evolution. It has enabled us to evolve from a single-celled organism to the dominant species on the planet. Of course, he sounded way cooler saying it than I just did. That first movie, with a long series of sequels that later followed, was released in the year 2000. And even then, the producers were quite comfortable using that as an opener because culture had been influenced by the story of evolution for many generations by that point. And today, it's even more embedded in people's minds, virtually taken for granted by most people who've made their way through the state-run public school systems in the West that have taught the story of evolution as supposed scientific fact. Indeed, Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, has been said to be the most influential modern book in relation to its impact on Western culture, because the concepts it proposed have radically changed society. Simply put, the overarching implications were that God, and certainly not the Bible, weren't necessary to explain our origins, and that the biblical account of creation was false. In essence, it was saying what a phrase often associated with the X-Men franchise describes them as: simply children of the atom, not children of Adam. Now, when Darwin first proposed his version of evolution, because there certainly were others before him, he cited one mechanism over and over again, hinting there might be others, that he said he believed could evolve creatures over time. And that mechanism, of course, was natural selection. Unfortunately for atheistic materialists, there was only one problem with the idea that natural selection was the answer to where we came from, that it could somehow transform one creature into new, never-before-seen life forms. It just didn't work. Why? Well, pretty soon after his theory started to become popular, it was pointed out by many of his detractors that any selection process, whether natural or not, can only choose from things that are already in existence, i.e., it's a culling process, not a creative one. You see, living things have built-in genetic variation. For example, a dog population that adapts to a cold environment may do so by losing genes for short hair, leaving only long-haired genes in the population, i.e. the dogs with genes for short hair may die off due to the cold, leaving the ones with long hair that can survive in that climate to pass on their long-haired genes. And of course, the reverse situation could happen with short-haired dogs in a warm desert setting. However, the parent population of dogs already had genes for long and short hair in the first place, or else those genes couldn't have been selected for. So, in fact, by environmental factors choosing some genetic information in preference to others, natural selection may eventually get rid of information not selected for in certain populations. But a loss of genes is the opposite of evolution, which requires gaining novel information. Try dropping a group of dogs that only has genetic information for short hair into a freezing cold environment and see what happens. They likely won't live long enough for you to see much of anything. To really emphasize the issue here, understand that evolutionists believe that primitive single-celled organisms have slowly changed into various different kinds of creatures like mice and meerkats and moose, monkeys and men over millions of years. And yet, if this were true, the original DNA library of a microbe would have undergone a massive net increase of functional genetic information during the stages of transformation during the alleged millions of years. Because single-celled organisms don't have genetic instructions for blood and bones and blood clotting systems or lungs or eyes or ears and a myriad of other things the other creatures have. For the story of evolution to be true, there would have to be some mechanism that constantly gives rise to new genetic information. And evolutionary scientists admit that natural selection can't do that. As an example, if you and your friend go out to a buffet dinner, you might both select different items from the platters. But the food you choose was already there. And your selecting food from a buffet table doesn't cause new kinds of never-before-seen food to pop up onto it. People need to understand, natural selection has never been seen to produce new words, sentences, or chapters in the DNA library of genetic information in living things. Metaphorically, natural selection would be like choosing books out of a library, but it can't write new books or paragraphs or sentences or words that never existed before into the library of information of living things. Now, because of this, informed evolutionary scientists realized that in order for the story of evolution to remain at all plausible, they needed a new evolutionary engine or mechanism to keep it alive. They needed something that could supposedly produce brand new genetic information, i.e., novel, greater variation, that could lead to different features in living things which could then be selected from. The most widely accepted new mechanism is, of course, just what Patrick Stewart's fictional character, Professor X, explained in the movie opener: genetic mutation. Now, mutations are basically spelling mistakes in DNA, either copying mistakes that occur when DNA replicates or produces copies of itself, or misspellings of DNA sequences brought about by external environmental factors, such as UV light or cigarette smoke, radiation, excessive alcohol consumption, taking drugs, etc. And this inclusion of genetic mutation, combined with natural selection into the evolutionary story, led to what's known as Neo-Darwinian theory, New Darwinism, which, when you analyze it, basically says that mutations supposedly provide novel functional genetic information which natural selection then sorts out the best of. And this materialistic 1-2 punch has been widely promoted to have supposedly provided the knockout blow against any opposition to a naturalistic view of life's origin. However, as an analogy, this is like saying that if we start off with a simple children's book like Little Red Riding Hood, for example, and we make a copy with some spelling errors in it, and then continue the process over and over again with new spelling errors introduced into each subsequent manuscript, then eventually it could turn into the works of Shakespeare. But of course, no one has ever seen the equivalent happen in living things. That's the stuff of science fiction, like our fictitious heroes, the X-Men. But it certainly isn't observational science. Now, popular sci-fi movies and comic books like the X-Men might portray mutants as genetically superior, gifted with special abilities, and more highly evolved. This is the whole idea of where their special gifts came from. But reality is a far different story. Comic book portrayals of evolved superheroes may appeal to the imagination of young and old alike. But in the real world, doctors discovering a significant mutation in someone is unlikely to be cause for celebration. Far from it. Mutations can cause severe disease, such as cystic fibrosis, cancers, sickle cell anemia, Marfan syndrome, and Huntington's disease, just to name a few. Mutations may tend to be most often fairly harmless, but they tend to break things overall. And this is because, like natural selection, mutation is an information losing mechanism, not an information gaining process. Like scrambling the information in a computer program, the corruption of DNA code has never been seen, even once, to add novel, functional genetic information for never-before-seen forms, functions, and features in living things. And scientists have used radiation on various animals to study the effects of genetic mutation for a while now, in an attempt to speed up and observe the supposed evolutionary process. Its results have been observed to range from no effect to severe defects, but never additional truly novel and functional genetic information. Results such as hairless and cancer-ridden mice, wingless fruit flies, and even flies with legs growing out of their eyes have been observed, but there have been no examples of fruit flies turning into butterflies or anything else other than fruit flies for that matter. No creatures developing new, never-before-seen functional structures, i.e., no sort of evolution has been observed. As Dr. Lee Spetner, a respected scientist that studied the subject for many, many years, said in his book, Not by Chance, all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not to increase it. And despite thousands of scientific papers on the subject being produced worldwide since then, no one has provided a hands-down argument in any scientific study that has empirically demonstrated anything that contradicts his statement. Now, over the years, I've had many a person in a queue from Calgary to Edmonton. I drove from Calgary to Edmonton. I drove from Calgary to Edmonton. In all of these examples, there is not an increase in new, useful information. In order for the sentence to evolve, it would have to read something like, I drove from Calgary to Edmonton in a Honda Civic, and it took me 3.5 hours to get there. Now, in this case, there would be novel and potentially useful information. But genetic mutations have never observed providing this kind of additional information to DNA. They're no help at all in explaining naturalism. However, it should be noted that mutations can be beneficial in certain circumstances, just not beneficial to the story of evolution. So-called beneficial mutations are often used by evolutionists as proof of evolution, but all fail to qualify when examined. Why? Because examples like wingless beetles, brought about by a mutation that stunts the normal growth of their already existing wings, that live on a windy island surviving better, because they don't get blown out to sea like the non-mutant winged beetles do, is a poor way to explain how amoebas supposedly turned into mankind over millions of years. This specific mutation may be beneficial to those particular beetles in that particular environment, but again, it doesn't benefit the story of evolution a bit. It's just Here's an example. H. pylori are bacteria that can attack the stomach and cause severe problems. To fight this, doctors prescribe an antibiotic, which is absorbed through the bacterium's cell wall. Inside the bacterium is an enzyme that converts the antibiotic into a poison, which kills the bugs. But sometimes these bacteria mutate, and they corrupt the proper DNA instructions for the enzyme, so that it's no longer produced by the bacteria. This isn't enough of a loss to kill the bacteria. And because of the loss of the enzyme, the antibiotic can't be converted to a poison, and the bugs now survive the same antibiotic that would have previously destroyed them. So it might appear that the acquired resistance is because the bacteria somehow developed new traits and/or features they'd never had before. But it isn't. They survived because of a loss of genetic information, not an addition of it. The almost fanatical atheist Richard Dawkins, who is still likely the leading champion of the story of evolution, has repeatedly revealed his faith in the non-observable. For example, he stated in an interview that evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. So, according to materialists like Dawkins, millions of years of chance random processes supposedly produced all the various life forms that have ever lived on Earth, through this amazing process called biological evolution. But even though this is believed by millions of people, perhaps the most revealing portion of his quote is when he admitted that evolution, hasn't been observed. And that
his analogies on natural selection and genetic mutation. Those are some of the main things you hear when evolution is taught. Natural selection is the process, that they say creates animals or provides new animals and new material, new information. But it's just a selection process. It's not a creating process. And that's when genetic mutations comes in. So they say genetic mutation plus natural selection is what makes evolution possible. And that's the 1-2 knockout punch. Once you hear those two things, for most Christians, it's hard to combat that if you have no knowledge of science. But genetic mutations, as he so eloquently stated, it's not a creation process either. In fact, genetic mutations are defects. They're errors in the genetic code. They don't provide new information like X-Men. You're not getting new features. You're not getting brand new stuff when you have a genetic mutation. In fact, it's the opposite of evolution. All of the scientific evidence points to mutations do not present or create anything new. In fact, it keeps things the same or makes it worse. This is the death knell for evolution. Mutations do not make things better. And there's never been a situation where it has worked. So how can we sit here and say macro evolution is true? It is not. What we get, speciation, variation within the same kind of animal, but it's the same kind of animal. You cannot get a single cell into a human. Man, it's absolutely science fiction. Creation is obviously something that's not scientifically observable, but so is evolution. It is not scientifically observable. No one has ever seen a monkey evolve into a human, an amoeba evolve into a human. It's not observable. So it's not science. It's a religion. It's a belief. It's a faith, just like creation is a faith. But I love the last point he made. Creation is a faith. It's a belief. But the historical evidence for the Bible, the reliability of the scriptures, the preponderance of evidence for Jesus Christ being a historical figure outweighs anything that evolution can remotely present as historical or reliable. So don't let an evolutionist tell you about macroevolution ever again. There's no science to back it up. Everything, every animal, every species on Earth today is exactly the same in the fossil record. Exactly the same. They're the same creatures. Nothing is different today. Whales are still whales. Dogs are still dogs. People are still people. So where is the evolution? Where is the macro changes? They're not there. The missing links are still missing. So you can trust the Bible. You can trust the Word of God. Thank you, Calvin Smith, for a phenomenal breakdown of the theory. Emphasis on theory of evolution. If you enjoyed this video, you want more content like this, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Like this video. I'll be back next week with another one. This is Pastor Frederick. This is about a book, and everything I do is about a book.